it's a pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to invite Chris to come and deliver his lecture.
Thank you.
Chris.
Thank you, Vaka, and thank you, Anna. Do you mind if I take my hat off?
Take it.
In fact, it reminds me of my doctorate, and I think I was about 39 when I finally got my PhD. And I'd laboured under the name of Mabey for many, many years. And in fact, even just 2 weeks ago, I was in a pub with Phil, who I thought was coming tonight, but he hasn't turned up yet. But and I went to the bar and I said, I made the order, and the lady said, can I have your name? And I said, Mabey. And she said, no, stop messing around, I need your name. So when I got my doctorate from Brunel, I thought I'd change my name to Dr. Definitely. But I couldn't make my mind up. Okay, an inaugural. One of my daughters, Zoe, eldest, said, what is this, Dad? What's this inaugural thing? Surely it's an augural, not an inaugural. Well, so I decided to look it up. And actually in the dictionary, it says to ceremonially induct, as in inaugurate a factory. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that Middlesex is a factory. Far be it for me to suggest such a thing. Or, you know, when something augurs well, the idea is that it's to predict from signs or omens. It's an interesting idea. So in this session, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a little bit with the, and I'll get out of the way of the screen in a second. I'm going to play a little bit with the idea of knowledge. I guess some of you are here from other disciplines or no disciplines, and so actually it's actually quite a big task, isn't it? What is knowledge? I'm going to just talk about that for a while, and then I'm going to report briefly on some research, which is maybe the thing that got you here, to do with the Atlas particle physics experiment, because I'm also an eminent physicist. And then I'm going to reflect on some paradoxes that arise from that research. And then finally, because an inaugural is an opportunity. Indeed, you're invited to be slightly more reflective, slightly more expansive and self-disclosing. I'm going to finish on a sort of personal note and offer some omens, offer some portends for the future, as in the spirit of an inaugural. So that's where we're going, folks. So you ready? Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. See if I can get this working. So these are the questions. And just to sort of ease us into the whole notion of knowledge management and knowledge itself, I thought it might be helpful to see a vertical axis there. From that, can you all see that from the back? It's a little bit faint. At the bottom, if you like, in the uncodified or concrete. Well, I've tried that. I think this is the best we're going to get. Oh, that's slightly better, yeah. So we have experiential knowledge, uncodified, not structured, and if we go up that scale, we have something which is more shared, more to do with stories, more to do with fables, more to do with the way things get passed on, and we get at the top of the scale with structured or codified or abstract knowledge, something which we might call symbolic knowledge. Now, whoops, it goes a bit faster than I thought. Okay, so this first one is about sensing. The second one is about what can I say about this subject? What can I tell you? In fact, I think it was Michael Polanyi who said, "We know more than we can say." Interesting phrase, that. Have you found yourself in conversation sometimes talking to somebody who's asking good questions and listening, and that's quite rare, and you actually find yourself sort of talking quite energetically and quite knowledgeably about something, and you realise you actually know more than, there he is, this is Phil.
Hi, Phil.
And actually, I should have said thank you for battling North London traffic and being here, those of you who've come from afar. And then abstract or symbolic knowledge is, what can we extract from this? What can we actually say about it, which is, if you like, slightly more the procedural level, slightly more static, slightly more structured and durable. And another way of putting this, if we then add in not just the structuring axis, but the sharing information axis, we move from knowledge, which is the bottom left of that curve, right through to the top right. And if I put some words around that, or a picture, oh, sorry, it's gone quickly again. Oh. Ah, there you go. So we might think of the Zen master in his garden, singular, experiential, one-on-one, quiet, tacit. This is the nature of that kind of knowledge, okay? Not easily discerned, not easily captured, quite soft, but very real, very tangible, very palpable, very powerful, but one-on-one. Now, if you go to the far extreme, we might typify this as bond traders. Sitting in front, we've got one living next door. Goodness sakes, I do envy his job. Drives 2 4x4s, not at the same time, but he, and you know, wants to put massive extensions on the back of his house, which I don't like so much. But they make a lot of money by having instant access in milliseconds to data which is globally dispersed. So if you like, that's the other extreme of knowledge. Very impersonal now, totally detached from any sort of context, except it has material and financial value, very much so. Okay. Sorry about this. Okay, so if we were to put this into a slightly more industrial or organizational language, you can follow that graph round. We start with core competencies, an interesting question that perhaps you've asked of your organization. We may have asked here in the university is, what are, in fact, Vakar did actually touch on this, what are our core, difficult to copy, difficult to poach competencies? What is it that we have that when you mesh it together with the other bits and pieces of our organization actually put us a class apart from other people? It's a very interesting question that organizations ask of themselves. And so, but that's often quite difficult to get hold of, even though we have a sense of what it might be. If you push that up to the patents and copyrights, here's where it begins to get more formalized. Here's where it begins to get more concretized, okay? And if we just use the word competency, we're moving from that which is core and that which is vital to the organization but unarticulated to that which is often codified, very much so, in a competency framework. I wouldn't be surprised, I perhaps should know this, does this Middlesex operate a competency-based approach in its HRM? It doesn't, no. That's fine. Because I think the difficulty with competency-based approaches is they become fixed, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But then if you move across right here, can you see if we're moving from this arena to here, we're more in the territory of industry-wide principles. So now the knowledge is generally well understood, very, very well shared, accessible to all, and to some extent has lost its value, but still has some value, especially in terms of applications. And then if we drop down here, so highly diffused but not codified, we have general wisdom, which I think is an interesting word. Wisdom, I'll come back to that. Now, if we put some other language around that, you perhaps have already spotted that no one of these types of knowledge is itself superior. Each has its pros and cons, each has its benefits and its potential. Obviously, in terms of personal knowledge, it's very rich and very powerful, as I've already referred to. But the difficulty often is it's untapped, or it's tapped in a very sporadic way. Or it's fragmented, or it leaks, as Vakar just mentioned. people coming and going from organisations and taking vital knowledge with them. And this is a crucial issue for not just Britain, but let's just talk about Britain, in terms of the cuts in the public sector at the moment. Think of the knowledge, the tacit, hard-won, experiential knowledge that is leaving the door with that person, with each of those people. If we think of proprietary knowledge, which is a term I would give to the slightly more codified and, if you like, slightly more structured, the difficulty here, as I just alluded to with competency frameworks, is they get locked in. It fossilizes, it's static, it doesn't move with the times, and it isn't always very well exploited. And if we move to public knowledge and conventional wisdom, public knowledge, and we've got a fantastic case in point here with Operation Prism. What's happening? What's happening is that American intelligence agency is actually delving around in personal databases to derive public knowledge, but keeping it secret. What happens is that it's uncontextualized. It's unvalidated. Take another example, Expedia. It's there. I mean, most of us use Google several times a day or a similar search engine, but don't often stop and think about, well, how well validated is that? Particularly Expedia, or Wikipedia, I should say. And then conventional wisdom, the issue here is about learning. The issue is, do we have people in our organizational space who are looking outwards as well as inwards? Who are doing the scanning, the boundary scanning, across disciplines, across cultures, across professional groupings. Because without that, you actually cut off your air supply and you become very complacent with success recipes. So you do need this conventional wisdom too. Are you with me so far? This is probably the most theoretical that we're going to get. So if you're still with me, that's good. Let's now contextualize this in relation to Atlas. Atlas, as you probably know, is a global experiment, one of 4, based in Geneva, CERN. And they're a fascinating organisation, which is why I'm delighted to be researching them with a team of people. If you can't read that at the bottom, there's 38 countries involved, 173 institutions like us, university departments. When I was at Birmingham, just across the road, the Department for Astronomy and Particle Physics were involved in this project. And 3,500 scientists, some of them technologists, but mainly particle physicists. Britain puts 100 million a year into this project. Social scientists, now is your time to cry. Okay, so this is the context, this is the organization. In case you're not familiar, there's a 17-kilometer underground tunnel. It's called a Large Hadron Collider beneath the French-Swiss border. And that's where they throw the particles together at high speed, in fact, almost the speed of light. And when they collide, and this is the whole point about the experiment, I'm making it sound awfully simple, but this is probably 30 or 40 years in the making. When they collide, they can observe the debris on the screen. And in that debris, they want to find the Higgs boson. That's right, and they think they found it. Oh, wrong one. Now, just to give us a sense of scale here, I think the most interesting thing about this diagram, which is the detector, is this. That's a person. The rest of it passes me by, really. Magnets, detectors, calorimeters. But look at the scale of it. This is huge. This is huge. Now, what we did is we worked with Atlas over a period of 2 or 3 years, funded by the ESRC. And a colleague of mine, and I have to give credit to both Max Boiseau sadly no longer with us, died 2 summers ago, and Martin Ehrig. Martin, both of them are economists, and actually got on, surprisingly, because I was far more interested in the sociological, the psychological dimensions of this experiment, and they were more interested in knowledge assets and how they got measured and mapped. So credit to them, they did some mapping. And whoops, this is very sensitive, this little button here. So sensitive that I'm going to use this one, I think. Okay, so what they did is they asked, I think it's around about 80 in the end, scientists, to think about, and you might want to just reflect on this question in relation to your own job right now. What is it in terms of knowledge that allows you to perform? What do you need to know in precise terms to allow you to really get the best from you, your team, and those people around you? That was the basic presiding question. And then through some quite sophisticated questioning, T-diagrams and process of elimination, they identified a whole number of what they called knowledge assets. Now, I don't want us to get carried away with the size of the bubbles and all the different labels, but what I do want us to focus on, and hence the little red dashed line, is the bottom left corner. Isn't it interesting that what comes out in this, remember this is tacit, uncodified, undiffused. This is where we are in the map. So we're still using the same map. We have things like presentation skills. We have things like project management. We have things like interpersonal skills, people management, meeting management, and participation. Now, they weren't putting them on the map. They were just saying where these were in terms of priority and importance. When you map them, you find that they come undiffused and uncodified. And that was absolutely stunning for the people when we showed it to Marcus Norberg and his team at Atlas, because they hadn't realized, they had an inkling that this might be the case, but they hadn't realized quite the implication. And the implications are these. Goodness sakes, we've got a lot of tacit understanding, particularly in the soft areas, particularly in the, if you like, the HR, the HRM areas, which we are actually not leveraging. They're leaking. It's sporadic. Some people come to CERN, and typically, you know, if you think of your field, going to CERN is like the best thing you could do, like coming to Middlesex. It is the, you know, the absolute peak of your academic prowess to come and be associated with Anna Kyprianou at Middlesex. This is it. So think of it in those terms. I'm not sucking up to her at all. And so, how do you then develop that tacit understanding? How do you manage people? You see, they get so engrossed in the task that they don't actually think about the people dimension, which is quite a telling thing. They're very, very committed, don't get me wrong. They're very, I mean, they work all night and forget which meal it is they had last. You know, so that it's not like they're uncommitted, but they, the actual people, the intentional people development is very sporadic. So you may get hooked up with a very good senior scientist and have a fantastic induction when you arrive at CERN. Absolutely the best thing, but you might be unlucky. It's very hit and miss. And how do we strategically develop value? You might say that's a bit incongruous. Surely, you know, CERN, Atlas, they've got this 100 million coming in each year. They don't have to worry. Actually, they do. Because they have Jonathan Butterworth, you hear him on the radio, has to go and fight his corner with all the other scientists, with the appropriate ministers, and make sure he gets funding and a steady stream. Because this is huge money that it takes to keep this Hadron Collider going. And then there's this added dimension of as people move to CERN, as people move to Geneva and back again, from their home institution, under a different aegis at CERN, back to the home institution, that managing the knowledge flow in that process globally, 37 countries, 173 institutions. You imagine the knowledge flow and the potential for leakage and duplication and the missing things is very high in that sort of situation. Right, I want to move on to some paradoxes. So now I'm going to sort of, if you like, talked about knowledge as a sort of in a very simplistic but theoretical way, and giving you a framework. I've then applied that framework, again I'm just taking snippets, just an extract, to a particular organisation, that is Atlas experiment at CERN. Let's sort of try and rein it in a bit to us, because we're all, just looking around the room, I know most of you, but not all of you. But even by association with this place, we are in a knowledge-intensive organisation. We are what you might call knowledge activists. You may not have thought of yourself as one, but you are. So what can we learn from this little foray into the rather unusual world of particle physics in Geneva? What can we pick up that might have some relevance to us? And I like to think of it as some paradoxes. And these paradoxes are slightly overstated, just to make a point. The first one, the more knowledge is managed, the less likely valuable knowledge will be exchanged. Hopefully you're sort of mildly surprised by that. I'd like to get into a discussion, but I'll resist. Let me just explain. Some of the knowledge features associated with the Atlas experiment are the follows. They have a very definite shared goal. Now you can say, well, that's pretty typical. Most organizations have an organization mission statement, da-de-da. But this is something which they are highly committed to, for furthering science, not just them, not just their careers, not just their institution. In fact, it helps raise their perspective above the parapet of their pet project, right? This is important. So it sort of allows people to work together and have an interdependence, which most organizations would die for. And remember, this is with, and if you've, well, I guess this goes for most academics, but it certainly goes for the scientists I've met at CERN. They're very autonomous individuals. You know, they are very loath to be managed, I put it that way, okay? And for them, and I've heard them talk about, because we did about 60 or so interviews apart from the mapping, they say, actually, I'm going to retire before we know everything. But I want to hand on to the next generation something which is intact, something which has integrity, something which is valid. It's important to me intergenerationally. That is a huge, huge lesson. And so if we apply that to the world of universities or your world, wherever you are organizationally located, for me it picks up on 2 or 3 things. We need to learn how to leverage, in the best sense, personal knowledge. You know, the bottom left-hand corner, the tacit stuff. And that isn't done necessarily by putting it into a procedural manual. In fact, that will kill it. So it's a bit more subtle than that. It calls for, to go to the bottom one, mentoring, coaching. You're probably already there. In fact, a number of our colleagues in the business school here are researching and in fact have pioneered mentoring programs with students in this university and overseas. Fantastic, because this is exactly what it's about. It's about finding ways of connecting senior, experienced, if you like, the Zen master to characterize it, with the upcoming apprentices, with the people who need to learn. Okay, so coaching, mentoring, apprenticeships are very much part of the game here. And what about management? Well, a lot of the knowledge management literature, and you may know this better than I, but because I've come into it sideways a little bit late, but it's huge. But a lot of it is about governance systems. A lot of it is about IT. A lot of it is about putting in place the mechanisms, the procedures, putting in place intranet, putting in place things that will enable people to talk to each other. Do they talk to each other? Yes. Do they share important things? Rarely. Because it's more, I think it's both and. You need, it's necessary but not sufficient. You actually need light touch. Sorry, I knew she was going. I haven't said anything to offend her. I don't think. You need light touch management or governance rather than these people being micromanaged. So there's an interesting set of lessons there coming out of that first paradox. Second paradox, the more democratic knowledge sharing is desired, the more intentional leadership is required. Now you may say, hang on a minute, Chris, that doesn't make sense. You want to have democracy, you want to have people sharing stuff, you want it to be organic, and now you're saying lead it? Well, yes. Yes. It does need intentional leadership. Let me give you two examples. One of the first interviews we did was with a guy called Peter Yenny. And there were 5 or 6 of us in a room not dissimilar to this, with a round table. We're sitting there waiting for this guy. He heads up, or did head up, the Atlas experiment from 1990 till about 2011. Multi-million-dollar scientific experiment, and he was basically running it. A little bit later, this guy walks in with a hard hat, puts it on the desk, and starts talking to us about Atlas in a very discursive way, just chatting, telling the story, and we were just captivated. I mean, we're meant to be writing notes. We just sort of sat there listening. And then, after 40 minutes, he said, well, gentlemen, I must be on my way now. And I did write this down, his passing comment was, things work when people identify themselves with the project. And he left the room. Charismatic leader? Big hero? Influential? He really did embody the ethos of this experiment. Now, I don't know whether the experiment created him or he kind of had an influence. Maybe it was a two-way thing. Very, very interesting. In other words, there was leadership going on. There was ethos creation going on. But it wasn't heavy-handed leadership. And the other thing, and again it's CERN related, is that I shall never forget the first time, and I've been there many times since, walking into the canteen at Geneva. Now, it's huge. I mean, it's probably as long as this campus. It's a huge building. And by the way, the buildings at CERN are not sort of swish. They're kind of, it's a bit like an Eastern European sort of university. Sorry if there's any Eastern Europe. Sorry, terrible thing to say. Cut that from the tape. But you know what I mean. Okay, so nothing special about the buildings. But this canteen is a buzzing with conversations at each table. And as you pass and as you get your lunch and you sit, what are they talking about? They're talking about physics. They're talking about physics. It's incredible. And, okay, occasionally last night's football game comes into it, but it's generally speaking work stuff. It's like a bazaar. In fact, Raymond, a theorist in this area, in open source communication, talks about a cathedral and a bazaar. And a bazaar is where you go and trade. You take your stall down there, you put it out, you see who comes, you do a bit of bartering, people go away with a handful of stuff, and you feel good, and it's like that, and the stuff you're bartering is knowledge. Fascinating. And it's something to do with architecture, you know. It would happen in a small place, but it wouldn't quite be the same. So Arup might want to think about this. It's a big space, and I don't know whether they created it intentionally or whether it's just turned into be a very important bazaar-like situation. But boy, it works. So the lessons. I would say the lesson is simply this: in order to retain innovative edge, we need to develop leaders. who are strong in setting the ethos, but, please work. I am pressing the button. Dear. Oh, there it is. Where'd it go?
You put it upside down.
No, I've got it up the right way up. It sort of happens on every third press. Okay, that's better. Strong in setting the ethos, but nudge to make it happen. So in other words, there is leadership, okay? There is leadership going on. It's strong. It's ethically based. There is a strong sense of what is required in terms of overall feel. But to make it happen, you don't put in heavy, clunky systems. You actually nudge to make it happen. Okay, you with me so far? The third paradox is the more knowledgeable the professional, the less likely he or she is able to lead. Now, I'm being deliberately provocative here because I'm talking to a number, if not all of you, as experts in your field. So, bear with me for a second. I guess what I'm saying, and I'm going along a little bit from Atlas here, but I'm also using my Atlas experience. There's something about the knowledge domain that actually inhibits leadership, in my view. And it's this: we specialize. We're constantly specializing and getting more and more knowledgeable about a smaller and smaller area. And there's all sorts of reasons why this happens. Some of them are to do with publications, some of them are to do with reward systems. But what we fail to do is keep that balance of scanning. Do you remember I mentioned in terms of conventional wisdom? Or, yeah, the conventional wisdom. The other thing about science, and I think it goes for social science too, is that we learn to distrust dubious data. How many conferences have you sat in where, you know, somebody's telling their lovely story about their research and somebody says, yeah, but what about the sample size, you know? And did you use structural equation modeling? And, well, yeah, those things are important, but give me a break. I mean, we can, you know, we need to learn to cater for the countercultural, you know, for the anomalies. Let's be listening as well to the stuff that doesn't fit. And I think what science and social science does is it drives us into being mistrustful of anything that doesn't quite fit our little intellectual matrix. And the other thing about Atlas is that they are very hot on analysis, but they couldn't care less about application. It's amazing. And of course the British government say, well, what are we going to learn from this? What are we going to get from this? We're putting all this money into it. What technologies can we use in biomedical field? You know, in space technology. And in fact, there are a few. And in fact, it's well known that Tim Berners-Lee worked at CERN, thought, hey, we need to learn to communicate better with each other across these, it wasn't 37 countries then, but a huge number of countries, and actually left CERN to market it. CERN weren't interested. And then there's also this concentration on knowing what rather than knowing how. It's the product. And I think actually, dare I say, and I've benefited from funding agencies, but funding agencies can get caught in this trap too. They get so paranoid about having something to show for the money that they're putting into this research that it's got to be prescribed ahead of time. Where's the innovation in that? I mean, come on. And it's knowing how you got there. It's being observant to the process. And these Atlas scientists are just bemused. Why do you want to know? What do you want to come talk to us for? I mean, they just find it fascinating that we should be interested in how they do stuff. And the other thing that I think is true of science and social science, pure science or applied science and social science, is whether we like it or not, we reward. I mean, look at this. Here I am in my garb and my silly hat. No disrespect. Thank you for inviting me. I mean, I kind of quite like it, really. But come on, it's not just me. I have worked. I mean, Alison's one person there. I see her face. We've worked together. We've kind of, you know, had arguments. We've had brain ache, haven't we? Trying to figure out some of this stuff. And the same goes for a number of other colleagues. There's probably 5, 10 people behind me, around me, and you get picked out. Now, hopefully their turn will come. But Nobel Prizes are very much about solo efforts, although they think that 3 people will get it for the boson. And it's interesting. Marcus Norberg, who's the resources coordinator, so, I mean, they don't have executives and leaders and directors, they just have coordinators and spokespeople. But he's pretty influential. I asked him, I said, who are the others? And he said, well, one of them is there's Higgs, there's Eisenhart, or I think that's how you say his name. And he said, you know, I don't know who the other one is. So actually, even in that little microscopic sort of zone of research, Higgs has made his name already, and the other 2 are relatively unknown. Again, it's sort of solo effort. So what can we learn from this? Well, I think we can do 3 things. We need to focus on scanning, validating, contextualizing skills. Organizations need to have some people who are doing this. The outlier people, the people who are a pain in the arse, you know, the people who ask questions that other people aren't asking, and they feed the stuff in. And people say, I didn't want to know that, it doesn't fit. Well, don't worry, we'll make it fit. You know, we need people like that. We need those who are constructively deviant. I think Robert Chow said, kings of truth need dukes of doubt. Sounds very American, doesn't it? But I get the point. You know, we need the doubters in there and asking their questions, having the freedom to ask those questions. And we apply rigor to the process as well as the product. Paradox 4, hurrying on. The more informal knowledge sharing is, the more open to elitism it becomes. Again, I hope this sort of stops you in your track. That's the idea. You'd think, wouldn't you, that informal, organic, democratic knowledge sharing is the way to do it. I've already alluded to that with the cafeteria. The danger, if you hadn't already become aware of this, is that very structurelessness can be tyrannical. Can be tyrannical. Because when you've got in-groups, by definition, you've got out-groups. And virtual working ties in with this too. Let me give you an example. Okay, and this example, I want to compare, maybe it doesn't like the heat of my hand, here we are. The Atlas collaboration, I'm simplifying it, global reach, I've referred to these things already, generous in terms of their knowledge sharing. I mean, what other organizations say, yeah, come and talk to us? Not many organizations left like that these days, are there? Their technologies are highly inclusive. I've already referred to the World Wide Web. Built-in interdependence, that's not an accident. Every different institute and every different piece of the Atlas experiment is necessary. I can't do it alone. I need all of you guys, and we need to share. So it's very inclusive. They revel in their cultural mix. Oh, we are world scientists, global scientists. Doesn't matter what color of skin, where you're from. We just treat everybody, we're physicists first and foremost. You notice a touch of doubt in my mind, in the way I say that, and there's a steady income. Okay, they have to bid for it, but the income is coming. Now, if we interviewed, and I know it's a small subsample, 11, and I didn't do the interviewing. If I had done, I wouldn't have got this data. This is a case of knowledge. I would have got information. I wouldn't have got knowledge. A colleague of mine, Amy Wong, from Hong Kong, who speaks Mandarin, did these interviews, but of course she wined and dined them first. Not in a corrupting way, but seriously, you know the Chinese culture. You need to build a little bit of trust. And you just need to go through the ritual stuff, and even then you're still quite a long way out. But she got some excellent data. Now, again, forgive me for sort of slightly characterizing, but I think there's a lot of literature to support these characterizations up. Chinese, mainland Chinese culture is typically quite hierarchical. High initial mistrust. The guanxi, which is the networking, very exclusive network which goes with you throughout life. And slightly more in relation to the Atlas experiment, they were late to the game, and culturally speaking, they don't say I can't do it, even if they're thinking I can't do it, because face is important, and their funds, relatively speaking, are low. What happens? What happens is that they find it difficult to break into the in-group. So they're there at CERN, but not very often. English isn't their first language, so they're a little bit behind the game because it's fast and it's happening in English mainly. They're from a country which can't support them being in Geneva for a long period of time, so they're in and out. Culturally speaking, they differ. So it's actually quite difficult for them to take part quickly in this transfer of knowledge, which is happening fast, and it's happening at a tacit level around a coffee table. So if we take the lessons from this, I suggest that we need to reward those who are generous with their knowledge and savoir-faire. Savoir-faire. Do you like my French? We need to galvanize energy and resources around the big picture, resisting pet projects. And we need to scrutinize our processes and our in-groups and our out-group boundaries to see if unintentionally, perhaps, well, usually it is unintentional, there are people who are not actually at the party. Okay. And that requires some face-to-face working. It doesn't just happen on the intranet. So I'm nearly there. In terms of a summary then, I would say that we need to foster bridges of trust. In other words, the engagement has to be psychological. We got a flavour of that actually from the introduction. This place has something about it which I actually noticed as soon as I arrived. In fact, I'd heard about it before I came. Now you don't get that from brochures and websites, although they may help. You get it from relationships. You need to cultivate light touch leadership. In other words, leadership is distributed widely with attention to process. And I can't resist throwing this in. April and I spend a fortnight a year, if we can, in Myanmar, helping with a Bible Institute. And we stay in a hotel. And last year we stayed in this hotel, which was just a hoot, because it had obviously seen better days, and it had seen a grander time. But it was now swarming with local people. It was like the local village had moved in. And they were busy scurrying around, bringing stuff to their mates, and going down to the kitchen and carrying. And guests were sort of incidental. We kind of thought, well, you know, we're guests here. Maybe that was a Western presumption. Don't know. But, you know, there was a sign above the lift, and I still can't get out of it. You remember this, don't you, Ewan? Because Ewan was with us. I've got this right, haven't I? Focus on the task, not the people. Come again? I don't know whether that was directed at guests. I don't think so. I think it was directed at the workers. And they were being told to focus on the task, because obviously that's quite important when you're setting up a hotel. But excuse me, what about the guests? Oh, it's a hoot. Anyway, and also the third thing I'd say, build communities of trust. Why? Because in any organizational space, communities of practice, and I'm talking here about organic groupings of people, will happen. It will happen. The question is it intentional? Because very often those communities of practice not always line up with what the organization's trying to do. Let me finish, as I said I would, in the spirit of an inaugural, with 3 observations which are far more personal. No chuckling. Knowledge, I would say knowledge is moral, not just factual. Why do I say that? Well, let's just get to where I am. which is near the end. I think if we consider examples like Operation Prism, you could say that's a technological issue, but you could also say it's a moral issue. If you consider tax avoidance and tax evasion, that's about knowledge, supremely about knowledge. Is it just a factual issue? Or is there an underlying ethic associated with those questions? You see where I'm going? And schools or universities, you know, are we not in danger of sanitizing? And I know this happens in schools through our daughters and their children. And I think it happens in universities too. We actually end up, and I'm collapsing a whole lot of thinking into one provocative sentence, concentrating on marketable skills. Is that what we're about? Is that really what we're about? Whether it be at a school or a university? Gardner said, the university stands for things that are forgotten in the heat of battle, for values that get pushed aside in the rough and tumble of everyday living, for the goals we ought to be thinking about and never do, for the facts we don't like to face, and the questions we lack the courage to ask. Now, for me, that's what a university is about. It's hard to do, you know, lecture at 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, and they troop in and they just want to know how to get through their exam. It's difficult not to collude. I was there last week. But we did some other stuff, and they liked it. And that's not just because of me, because I think they were stretching their minds a little bit. And so, knowledge starts with self-knowledge. It seems that this is Henri Nouwen. Henri Nouwen, as you may or may not know, is a Catholic priest theologian. He's dead now. And he was very successful professor at Notre Dame, Harvard, and around his 50s or 60s, I'm not exactly sure his age, he decided to jack it in. And he went to work for L'Arche, which is a home for mentally disabled folks in Canada. And this is what he said after a few months. It seemed as though I was starting my life all over again. Relationships, connections, reputations could no longer be counted on. Stripped bare. And it led him to conclude this: the leader of the future is called to be completely irrelevant and to stand in this world with nothing to offer but his or her own vulnerable self. Now, that's quite a statement and possibly overstated, but I think it really gets at something. That education is about the person and about the community we create, not just about the subject and the skills we pass on. And I would perhaps most provocatively of all say knowledge needs love. And what do I mean by that? Well, in Old Testament Hebrew, for those of you who are Hebrew scholars, you may know this. To know means to be in relationship with, to be intimate with. Now, we've come a long way since codified knowledge at the start of this talk. So knowledge is something that is relational. And I, you know, this deserves a whole lot more debate. Maybe you can talk about it over the sandwiches that you're gasping for now. That I think we have got stuck in post-Enlightenment thinking. And I think we have, if you like, decoupled a lot of what we teach and a lot of what we are saying and a lot of what we are trying to do with students from any kind of ethical or moral basis. And I think that's dangerous. You remember an inaugural, you can set some portends and you can speak some omens. I think this is dangerous. I think this is dangerous if we allow that decoupling to continue. Tom Wright is the professor of theology at St Andrews. He was the Durham Bishop of Durham. He says this: I believe a biblical account of knowing should take love as the basic mode of knowing, with the love of God as the highest and fullest sort of knowing that there is, and should work, so to speak, down from there. Interesting. And permit me one final thing. I don't keep a journal every day by any means, but I do sporadically keep it. And I thought I'd leave you with this. 28th of April, 2011. I don't know what prompted this, but I wrote, left to my own devices and reliance upon my own resources, I may make some well-intended but self-biased attempts to please you and to fulfill your instructions, because something of your divine image is implanted in me. However, energy quickly dissipates, my motives become mixed, and the results of my endeavour remain short-lived and ultimately of little worth. How much better to wait upon you to admit my weaknesses and to throw all my hope and dependence upon you, the living God, to allow you to shape my thinking, to influence my heart, and to inform my actions, to get up from the place of private prayer, inspired and equipped to do your work, a work which is fueled by faith, dignified by divine grace, propelled by spiritual power, and eternal in its effects. Thank you.